My name's Diana Joven. I lead the marketing organization here at Teleport, and it is my pleasure to introduce our closing keynote speaker today. At the start of the conference, Ev talked about one of our goals at Teleport being to reduce the friction between adopting new technology and security. And this tension between technology and security has persisted in this market for decades. And so that will be the topic of our conversation today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Joseph Menn has a very modest description on LinkedIn as being a digital threats reporter at the Washington Post. But I need my glasses for this, sorry. But he's one of the longest serving and most respected voices in security. He's covered security for 25 years at the LA Times, Reuters, now the Washington Post. He has published 3 books, 2 of them in the cybersecurity canon. The first one in cybersecurity was Fatal System Error, which showed for the first time that Russian intelligence agencies were working with organizing criminal hacking groups. And the second one is going to be part of the topic of the conversation today, which is the cult of the dead cow. This is a group that has had an outsized impact on security, but has really operated in the shadows. So it'll be really interesting to hear the story today. So please join me in welcoming Joe Menn to the stage. Now, your subtitle of the book is kind of interesting here. It says, How the Original Hacking Supergroup Might Just Save the World, right? Can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write the book and a little bit about what that subtitle is about?
So first of all, just a point of clarification, I don't want to get into any flame wars more than necessary. I mean supergroup in the rock and roll sense of the word, so that their members were typically had their own bulletin boards, led their own groups or whatever, and so they were assembled like the Eagles, right? You know, they were all sort of established before joining the cult of the dead cow. There are a lot of reasons I wrote this book, but one of them was, when I started, the security industry was a much smaller place. And now it is much larger, and it's gone so legit that you can go to a nice college and get a nice degree and work in a big company and do security things without having sort of like the street fighting aspect of it. And that's great, but there's actually something that's very valuable that comes from figuring out, well, I'm going to break the law. Is this a reasonable law? There's a lot of thinking about morality and what's okay and what isn't that the OG hackers dealt with. And you might not agree with where they came down on any one thing. They often disagreed with each other, but they actually put work into thinking about it. And I think that's very important now, because if you don't have some sort of moral grounding, some sort of moral discussions with your peers or with your elders, you can sleepwalk into doing some things that are actually not good for the company you're protecting or for society at large.
Terrific. Okay, so now your note at the beginning of the book, the very first paragraph, caught my attention. You wrote that you talked about how increasing technological advancement and complexity is increasingly at odds with issues of security and privacy. This is a very relevant statement for today, right? It's 5 years later. How do you think the world is doing? Which is winning? Is it complexity? Is it security and privacy? What's happening?
Well, I think privacy, the answer is obvious. I mean, pretty much everybody's social security number as of a month or 2 ago was for sale on the dark web. Privacy is just a complete disaster, which is why you need better and better biometrics and stuff for access control. In terms of complexity, it's also terrible, because nobody's trying to sell you less, right? There's no money in getting you to do less. So people will sell new security products, and that adds attack surface. And it's not just security products, but all manner of software. And the more lines of code, the more vulnerabilities you have, and the interactions you didn't think about. And the incentives are all wrong. It's very hard to measure the spend on defense and what's most effective and what isn't. But the sales guys, it's easy, for them to say, I sold more software today, and that's good. So we need something other than pure market forces involved here.
So one of the themes in your book is how ethical hacktivism, right, and maybe we'll need to define this, was able to drive change in a way that more traditional methods could not, right? You talked about the tension between what the CDC was doing at Microsoft, right? How they were trying to drive change at Microsoft and how some of the initial tactics did not work, and then later ones did. And these set the foundation for norms around vulnerability disclosure. So where do you think the software industry is today with corporate responsibility for security?
You're covering a lot of ground there. So,
right. You might back up and talk a little bit about the Microsoft story, right?
What I think is really interesting about the CDC is this kind of leveling up that they keep having to do. They weren't just talking to other hackers like they were in the beginning. They suddenly, your grandmother's online, 1995, Microsoft and AOL are making it for everybody, and nobody actually had an incentive to tell you it wasn't safe. The Microsoft doesn't want you to realize that you're driving a tank without a driver's license. And the security companies want you to be worried enough to subscribe to their services, but not so worried that you'll realize that they won't actually protect you from anybody serious. So the incentives are all wrong, and Microsoft was a court-certified monopoly at this point in the 90s. So what they did was they decided to pull stunts that got media attention, and so you have the New York Times and ABC with a microphone going to Microsoft and say, these guys say that anybody can hack your machines. They're demonstrating it in front of thousands of people. What are you going to do about it? And it was only that got Microsoft to start moving and taking security more seriously. Now, fast forward 20 years, vulnerability disclosure, I think, is now broadly accepted. Coordinated disclosure is the norm, unless you feel like making actual money and selling it to a nation state. And then I just hope you pick a nice one. So in some ways, it's much easier. Like most companies of any size now have security programs. There is a security at company.com email alias, and there are bug bounties. But if you dig into it, there's still big problems. Among other things, the major bug bounty platforms include like really nerve-shattering NDAs, and those apply even if the company doesn't fix the problem. So there can be a way to just sort of paper over, thank you for telling us the information, and now we're going to bury it, and here's a few bucks. So that's not a really ideal system. So there's still big picture, lots of things wrong, so it's time for critical thinking hackers to level up again and find new ways to affect change.
So the next part of this question, I will just warn you that Joe said there was bias embedded in the question. So I'm going to leave it the way I wrote it, which is, are we staying reasonably ahead of malicious actors, or are we falling behind, and what needs to change?
Right, so my problem with this question is that it implies that we are now ahead or ever have been ahead of the attackers, and I don't think that's been true for decades. I think we are getting creamed more than ever before, and the latest twist, first of all, nation states have figured out that this is a lot cheaper and easier to get away with than buying and firing a missile at somebody. And there are these fun gray areas where it's, maybe it's just a crime group that happens to have some friends in the security establishment, and therefore you have some plausible deniability for the havoc they're wreaking. And now, through the great wonder of artificial intelligence, generative AI, you don't even have to be a coder to affect some pretty serious shenanigans. So we are very much behind. I think that security, at like the top banks and at NSA is pretty good, and anything below that is kind of open season.
So many of the people in this room are leaders in their companies and thinking about access control, right? We're talking about how the CDC really drove impact in thinking about security in software. But now when we think about access control, right, the people in this room are really championing security around this issue. But it's sometimes difficult to elevate concerns about this to executive level. So we'll do a quick poll, right? How many people in this room feel that their executive teams really understand what's at stake here? Can you raise your hand? And how many people feel like there needs to be more attention at the executive level about what's at stake? Okay, I can't see very well here, but I think the second one had more hands, right?
Slightly more.
So do you have any advice for the people in this room about maybe things that you learned from covering the CDC about what it takes to drive attention to a material issue?
Well, at a surface level, it's a lot easier now than it was in the beginning when there wasn't a CISO, and if there was, they reported to somebody who reported to somebody, and on up. The SEC has done us all a big favor by emphasizing that the board needs an expert on this, that their breaches have to be disclosed within days if it's maybe material, and DHS and others have, and the critical infrastructure folks also have to report breaches there. So it's not as ridiculous as it used to be, where the only thing that had to be disclosed was like a personal information breach. So somebody, my favorite was when I was writing about like the Chinese being all over the defense contractors, Raytheon, whatever. Yeah, I'd have cold, like that they were completely owned by the Chinese, and go in there and tell them about it. Like, why didn't you disclose it? And they're like, well, it's not actually material off the record because, what's the Pentagon to do? Like, stop buying from us? It's not actually going to impact the bottom line at all. Now there is some impact to the bottom line. There has to be disclosures even when there isn't, there's much more awareness. So I think that there's an audience at the board level for this stuff, and CEOs think they're taking it on more. Now what you should do is show them stuff from CISA or the SEC or some of the nonprofits like the Center for Internet Security that have like sort of cheat sheets about what the biggest issues are by sector and how you can approach them.
So in the last session, I think Mark asserted that the CISO should not be on the executive team, right? Do you think because they're busy doing other things, right? But do you think there needs to be a different way that companies think about the structure and the discussion of security in the executive room and at the board level?
So, yeah, I think the way most people are seeing it is as risk now, right? It should be the CEO's job and certainly the board's job to think about risk, and cyber is just one giant risk. So I think that's the way to think about it, and that sort of gets you into their headspace. I'm agnostic about how many levels the CISO or CIO should be, but it shouldn't be very far. They should be on the same floor as the CEO because the stuff when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong.
Okay, terrific. So now at the end of the book, he talked a bit about how the role of the CDC or the role of hacktivism shifted from focus on breaches to other things, right? He talked about the relationship of hacktivism to propaganda content. Where do you see responsibility for this landing?
So again, what's interesting is they kept coming at problems in different ways. So one of them founded a billion-dollar company because security companies and regular companies wouldn't show you their code, and so you didn't actually know what it does. And you could have some third-party code audit that you may or may not believe. So one of them got deeply into binary analysis and built programs to decompile so you can see what the code was actually doing as opposed to what the vendor said it was doing. And they started catching all kinds of stuff, and that's a billion-dollar company called Veracode. Another of them went to DARPA and gave grants for cyber research to lots of little guys, ones and twos, instead of earmarking them all for like universities or IBM or something. So there a lot of rapid adoption into the government for security programs. The propaganda issue is also one that they have been, members have been thinking about for a while, certainly privacy stuff. So there is a current CDC project called VEILID, VEILID, which is kind of like an anti-Facebook social network. It's like Signal, but it has file transfer, whatever. It's still very early stages, but it's a framework for stuff that's nonprofit, so they're not going to collect anything on you, just the bare minimum to function. So identity and privacy are a part of fending off the propaganda stuff, because the most effective propaganda is targeted. I don't think that propaganda in the main is a security. It's not how most people think about security. Your CISO shouldn't be in charge of worrying about your employees, suddenly succumbing to some weird, cult or some foreign country's propaganda. But they are leaders in critical thinking if they're good. I mean, one of the things that attracted me to writing a book about these hackers, in 2019, is that it seemed like critical thinking was an endangered thing. And hackers, by definition, are critical thinkers because they're trying to make a system do something it wasn't supposed to do. So you're always thinking outside the box. And that's what we need to defeat propaganda. Is the general public has to engage in more critical thinking. I think our educational institutions have a big role to play. Civics class, maybe even English class should talk about media literacy. How do you evaluate the credibility of a given source? And that's something that in your community, security people, I think, can play a pretty big role in.
I think at the end of the book, you wrote about this, right? You said serious applied thinking is a form of critical infrastructure. And the best hackers are masters of critical thinking, and we cannot afford to ignore them. Do you feel like this was an attribute of the experience of hacking or the experience of the CDC in particular in their role in hacktivism?
So certainly in the old days, I mean, one of the interesting things about the population cohort that included the CDC is that they came of age after war games, and they learned about war driving and stuff like that, and before the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which took it all away 3 years later and said you couldn't do anything fun. So they started out skeptical of the government and more interested in technology. And until we got to this professionalization that I mentioned at the outset, the security industry grew out of a scene. It didn't grow out of academics. And so there are all these different cultural things that come into it. I think it's hilarious now that pretty much any Fortune 50 chief security officer, if he is of our age, my age, he broke the law when he was a teenager. If he didn't, he wasn't any good as a hacker. Because in the olden days, there were these things called long distance bills, and modems to get anywhere out of your area code would present your parents with a $500 phone bill. And so everybody cheated one way or another, the credit cards or free calling codes or something, or tapping the neighbor's phone line. So that's another reason they all think outside of the box, right? That's why you convince yourself that's okay. Nowadays, people tend to follow the law, so they have to apply critical thinking in other ways.
Now, one of the members of the CDC has also run for president.
Yes.
Right? And so how do you reconcile this stance between breaking the law and driving, that forward and running for the top position in our country's government?
Well, people are allowed to evolve and change. People should evolve and change. And I mean, this is what got the book so much mainstream press when it came out. But when I started writing it, I did not know that was going to happen. I don't think he knew that was going to happen. So to end the mystery here, it's Beto O'Rourke, who, he was one of the early formative members of the Cult of the Dead Cow. That had been kept secret by the group until the book came out. But he agreed to talk to me, and it's interesting when you look at his evolution. A lot of the stunts he pulled to put the spotlight on something, or to manage to call attention, for example, to a congressional sit-in over gun legislation when the C-SPAN cameras were cut, and he was streaming it to Facebook instead. There's a lot of stuff that was kind of the hacker mentality in what he did. You may disagree with him on any number of issues, but I do think he should get some points for not only helping form the greatest hacking group in U.S. history, but gender integrating it. He asked in a woman hacker who remains in it. So at the time, it was the whole rest of the scene was all guys. So I don't know, some points for that.
So one of the things that really impresses me about the book is that people talk to you, right, about these security matters that had been hidden for quite some, that they really operated in the background, right? How did you get so many characters in the book to talk with you and allow you to disclose who they were and what they'd been doing?
So it was a combination of factors. First of all, I mean, I've been at this a long time. There's actually an overlap between the people in the CDC and some of the people who were involved in Napster in the early days. And my first book was about Napster, so they knew people that I'd interviewed before, and you could ask them if I treated them fairly or not. A couple of the CDC members had already become public figures. Probably the best known is Mudge Zatko, who he's the guy that went to DARPA. He testified before Congress in '98 that he could take down the internet in half an hour. And he's gone on to, he was the head of security at Twitter, and before Musk bought it, and filed a pretty major whistleblower thing. So anyway, some of them are public. Some of them saw that Beto was on the record, and they're like, well, he's got the most to lose of any of us. Like, how much is my job really going to care that I broke some laws 20 years ago? And I think they really wanted to get the story out. They understood what my mission was. It was like that, to reclaim the word hacker as a good thing, to talk about the sort of crises that we're in now and the benefit of what they went through. And finally, honestly, I just got to give a big shout out to the statute of limitations.
So when do you think in security it's important to talk about the issues? And I will admit I have a vested interest here because I often talk with many of you in the audience about case studies, right? So when is it important to kind of talk about what you're doing, and when is it important to hold back?
So I think security through obscurity does not work, and the more educated discussion, the better. Now, there's a lot of crap journalism on this stuff, but there's also a lot of good stuff now, which there didn't used to be. Also, I think really a lot of the, when Google went public and said the Chinese hacked us in Operation Aurora, nobody thinks Google was a bunch of dummies. So I think the shame part has really gone away. And also, I don't think anybody should be really, certainly no private company should be expected to, protect everything from like the Chinese army or the Russian SVR. So people should feel more free to come out and say what happened so that others can learn from it. I mean, I think that many non-radicals like John Poindexter think that the government overclassifies information. I also think that corporations over-privatize information, and more should be discussed for the greater good.
One of the things that we also we heard about in the last session, was that we need to present objective evidence to drive investment in certain aspects of security. However, we're seeing in media information about breach after breach and the consequences of remediating those breaches, right? Shutting down systems, disrupting people filling prescriptions for weeks, right? How much objective evidence do you think companies need to know that we need more, right?
So, I mean, I still think in some ways the de facto CSO is the CFO. Deciding what to buy and how much to spend on it, and it still remains very hard. Even if they agree to spend X number of dollars, on what? There's so much different stuff, and is it another point solution? Is it a systems integrator? I think you sort of have to go back to the beginning and figure out what your crown jewels are and do threat modeling. What do you have that somebody wants? What are their capabilities? What would be the impact if they got in? And then start thinking about trade-offs. It might not be buying a bunch of new security gear with blinky lights and the word AI 3 times in the prospectus. It might just be put in an air gap for the actual critical trade secrets, and put it on a computer that doesn't connect to anything else. And that'll be a little less convenient. But there should be out of the box thinking in defense the same way there is in offense.
Terrific. Well, so I will admit that I actually can't see the clock from up here. So we have about 5 minutes, and I'd like to open the floor to questions that you might have for Joe before we close the session here.
Come on, bring it on. Well, they want to keep talking while they work up the nerve, and I am going to be
Yes.
signing books.
That's true. Yeah, so during the network reception, there is a table out, which I think many of you may have passed coming into the room. We have complimentary copies of the book here, and Joe will be available to sign it if you'd like. And it's definitely a fascinating book to read. You know, after I finished it, I thought this is kind of like the story of good versus evil, where the sides keep changing, right?
Which brings up something interesting. You know, at the end, you know, when I was trying to address the questions of who's a good guy and who's a bad guy, one of the people in the book said, well, it's more like the Dungeons and Dragons Matrix, right, where you've got lawful versus chaotic on one axis and good versus evil on another axis. So, you know, Germans during World War II were lawful evil, right? They were following the laws, it's just that the laws are terrible. The Cult of the Dead Cow is chaotic good. You know, whatever works, you know, whether it's, you know, throwing CDs into a crowd at DEF CON or, you know, pulling really bad pranks or testifying before Congress, you know. So that's the way, I think that matrix is a good way to think about the issues.
And I did have the opportunity to go to the book launch in 2019, and my one regret is that I had not read the book beforehand, because I would have loved to know more about the characters who were there, right, at the event. But anyway, please pick up a copy, and please join me in thanking Joe for joining us today.